Hi guys, it's Mr. Holman. I'm going to skip a lot of this slideshow. This is a slideshow I may end up going back and doing the whole thing for you. Usually I do it in class as a 40-minute class to kind of go through what a king's and family's life really was like. I'm going to skip down and kind of answer the questions that are required on your Pear Deck. I give you the link to this slideshow if you want to read these things. It'll tell you a little bit. But we're going to talk about one family. The mom was Eleanor of Antigua, and the father was King Henry II of England. He was the first of the Palatinate kings of England, which ran England for a long, long time. The two of their sons become king, and we're going to spend this last quest. King Richard was involved with the Crusades, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And the second son who becomes king is King John, who's going to lead us into the Magna Carta. So let's get started with the Crusade, right? So King Richard becomes king, and he immediately decides to go on crusade. So he has his mother, who, again, if the story we're all told, had used the kids to try to kill the father and started a civil war. Quite a story. She was in prison for 16 years or something. Anyways, she's out. Richard says, I want you to take care of the empire. I'm going to go crusading. So to make a long story short, he lands in the Holy Land in 1191. So this is the Third Crusade, and he fights the famous leader Saladin, whose image is here on the right. Saladin and King Richard do some pretty grisly things. They do some things they shouldn't have done, we'll say, but they also treated each other with great respect. During one of the battles, King Richard fell off his horse. Saladin stopped the battle, brought out his horses, and let King Richard pick his whatever horse he wanted. There was a deep respect between these two. They wrote letters afterwards. Ultimately, they do not get to Jerusalem. King Richard does not take Jerusalem back. That's why we had talked about in the Crusades that it was one and done. The Christians only won the first time. And he is heading home towards his mom. Some bad things happen. His boat that he leaves from basically Jerusalem and heads back is in a shipwreck. And so he dresses up and tries to pretend to be someone else and go across land. He is captured by Leopold V, the Duke of Austria, who was pretty mad. The Duke was on the crusade with King Richard, and when they captured Acre, which was a town in the Holy Land area, the Duke was the first one in the castle, so he hung his coat of arms over the walls. King Richard, when he came into the castle and took it over, he cut those straps, which is basically like slapping someone in the face and telling them you're stupid. And he hung his own coat of arms over it to say, no, the castle is mine, not yours. So he was mad. So he imprisoned him in the building you're looking at on the right. He was imprisoned for about a year and a half, and we'll kind of get to that. So the Duke, Leopold, wasn't strong enough, so he gave him to the King of England, or King of Germany. And the King of Germany says, look, we'll give you your king back if you give us 150,000 marks, or 100,000 pounds of silver. So in today's money, that's $20 billion. So the king is being held ransom in a castle. If you give us $20 billion, we'll let him go. Mom is raising the money. While she's raising the money, John, his younger brother, does not want him to return. He offers to pay 80,000 marks to the king of Germany to keep him. So he's like, please keep him. And then, because of course, if he doesn't come back, John becomes king. He's the next in line. And John really wants to be the king. He was the last son, so he was not guaranteed anything. No land. It was actually, his name was John the Lackland. He was really going to get nothing. So this was his big chance. Mom proceeds to raise the money. And on February 4th, 1194, he is returned, or he is released, and he heads home. He and John then fight a small civil war in England over control of the kingship. And on March 25th, 1199, he's walking around the castle, and you can kind of see the castle tower in the background of this image. This is the actual case. If you look here, you'll notice this is, it said it's in French because this was in France. He was in a French castle. And you'll see that the lion heart has an arrow through its heart. So this is where he died, right here at this castle. He was walking around looking at the walls of his castle to make sure it was good. And a somebody from the watchtower up above stood up with a crossbow and shot him. It was a 13-year-old. The arrow pierced, and I guess you can see me. So the arrow pierced something like here in a downward trajectory. So if you can feel your shoulder blade or your collarbone, that bone right here in your collarbone, it went between his collarbone, coming at a down angle, and came out his back right beneath his shoulder blade. And his guards immediately tried to yank and pull the thing out. Not very smart. You're supposed to cut the back off and slide it out. They didn't do that, and they kind of mangled it pretty bad. So he got infected. He knew he was going to die. So a couple days before he died, he brought Peter in. And the boy was going to be executed, but Richard, as his last act of mercy, forgave him, saying, "Live on, and by my bounty behold the light of day." So bounty is money. So what happened is King Richard brought him in to his deathbed and gave him 100 shillings, which is quite a bit of money, and told him to go live his life. He wanted to know why this kid shot him. He was a beloved king. Richard was really well liked. And the kid said, "Because you killed my father and brother." He did not kill his father and brother, but his father and brother went on the Third Crusade with King Richard and did not return. They were killed on crusade, but it wasn't Richard who killed them. He did bequeath all of his territory to John. So John becomes King of England. He gave his jewels to his nephew. And then on April 6, 1199, the day after Richard dies, King John takes the crown. On a sad note, we have no DA. We're not writing anything. That was just there. What happens to Peter? I almost hate to tell you since we're not together, but they flailed him. And failing him is to publicly skin him alive. So he was taken out to this village somewhere close to where we're seeing here in the streets, and he was flailed. So that links us to who becomes king. So I'm going to skip down here to this slide. And that leads us to King John. King John's very well known. He had lots of dogs. He was also known as one of the worst kings of all time. There's never been a king named King John after this one. Now, if you think about that, there's King Henry the First and Second and Third and Eighth, 12th, and Louis the Fourth and Louis the Seventh. Those are kings that people liked, so they named more people after him. There's only one King John. He was bad in most people's eyes. If you've ever heard the story of Robin Hood, this is where the story of Robin Hood comes. He fights King John. He steals from the rich and gives to the poor. That has something to do with what we're going to go into, and that is the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta is what this week's lessons are on. And I will tell you two quick things before we go. Rex means king. Think of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, the king of the dinosaurs. Lex means law. So during this, it was Rex Lex. The king is above the law. Magna Carta is going to flip that around. And Magna Carta is going to make it Lex Rex. The law is above the king. It's the most important idea to remember about the Magna Carta. And that's kind of this slide here. So the Magna Carta was done in 1215. So it's 16 years into John's reign, 16 years after King Richard dies. It means the Great Charter. There are 63 complaints that the nobles have about the king. So they just made a list of complaints, 1 through 63. And it was signed in Runnymede, England. You'll learn everything else you need to know in the rest of the slideshow.